The gnomes in Little Nightmares might seem like insignificant little critters, but they actually mean a lot more than you might know. Hello viewers, my name is Tericho and welcome to my channel where I explore, explain and expand upon the darkest worlds in video games. Today we're going to take a closer look at the gnomes in Little Nightmares. I'm going to attempt to explain what they are, where they come from, what they represent, and also some potential links to our own world as well. So it should go without saying that there's going to be spoilers in today's video. So, what are the gnomes then? The gnomes are these tiny little critters that run around most of the major locations in Little Nightmares. We see them in abundance in the moor and in the nest, and we also see plenty of references to them in the Pale City as well. They are these bipedal little creatures with pointy heads, and they do look very similar to a certain type of mushroom, which is actually very relevant, and we'll get onto that in a little while. The gnomes are sentient, they do have personalities and they do have activities that some like to do that others don't. Unlike most of the entities in the world of Little Nightmares, they don't seem to be evil, nor do they have any evil agendas. They generally just want to survive. They'll run away from things that they deem a threat, which is pretty much everything to them, including sometimes the children, and they will hide in places that they think no one else can reach. They also collect items, some things that they need and some things that they don't, and they all seem to have their own individual personalities, with some being mischievous and some being more skittish. So where do the gnomes come from then? Well, we actually know the answer to at least where some of them come from, and we know that from the Little Nightmares 1 DLC. At the end of the Little Nightmares 1 DLC, it's revealed that the lady turns the runaway kid into a gnome, and this is the unfortunate gnome that Six decides to snack upon. We see that the lady casts some sort of spell, and then the runaway kid wakes up as a gnome. It's not actually clear if this was her intended purpose, or if this was just a byproduct of a spell that she cast, but either way she leaves the runaway kid alone once he's turned into a gnome. This is also foreshadowed earlier on in the DLC. In the furnace room we see this room full of gnomes, with the shadows being cast on the wall, which are actually shadows of children, showing how all of these gnomes did used to be children. This is also implied in the nest as well in Very Little Nightmares. In Very Little Nightmares we see that the nest seems to be built to house many children, although there are very few here. There are, however, many gnomes here, implying that the gnomes that are here once also used to be children. It's possible that the Pretender did this because we know she has magic, although we don't know for certain. I also want to point out that it's not entirely confirmed that this is the only way that gnomes are created. If we look at a lot of fairy tales, a lot of times magic is used to turn people into frogs, so it's entirely possible that this is a similar sort of situation and that gnomes already existed in this world before people started turning people into them. We also see in the artwork of Little Nightmares 2 that it looked like the gnomes were going to have a house in the forest, although for whatever reason it didn't make it into the game in the end. But it does seem that in the world of Little Nightmares, gnomes can be found all over. Either magic is far more common than we know, or, as I've said, there are other ways that gnomes are created, or gnomes existed before all this magic business. So as I said earlier, gnomes kind of look like mushrooms. They look like a specific type of mushroom called a cone cap mushroom. And in fact, the first time I ever played Little Nightmares, I referred to these people as mushroom men before I realized they were actually called gnomes. This is actually more relevant than you might think. If you look at the milky cone cap mushroom, they look very similar to the gnomes, at least the gnomes' heads anyway. But what's really interesting about the milky cone cap mushroom is that they are sometimes called dunce cap mushrooms, probably because they resemble old dunce caps. Dunce caps used to be used in classrooms for, well, children that would misbehave or act like dunces. It was a form of shaming, kind of like they do in The Handmaid's Tale, and it was designed to shame people out of doing behaviours that were undesirable. What's really interesting is we see this in Little Nightmares 2. We see one of the bullies wearing this dunce's cap, and then we see a bunch of these caps in the next room, which I pointed out on my first playthrough really look like the gnomes' heads. Could just be a coincidence, but we also see these tiny mushrooms growing in a couple of places in Little Nightmares 2 as well. We see them around the woods near the hunter's house, and we also see them growing in jars in the school as well. So clearly, the mushroom and gnome connection is not just a coincidence. That could explain why the guests don't seem to bother with the gnomes at all, not even once. If you think about it, if you saw a random growing mushroom in a field, you probably wouldn't eat it, because some mushrooms can be poisonous and some can be psychedelic, and we'll come back onto that in a minute because that also could be relevant. But either way, it's not really a good idea to eat random mushrooms that haven't been prepared for you. Maybe this is why the guests don't bother with the gnomes. Maybe they don't like the idea of eating these random mushrooms that they see lying around, or maybe they're just not really that bothered by vegetables. I mean, let's be honest, they don't look like they eat their 5 a day. But as I said, mushrooms can also be psychedelic, which, if you want to go really deep down the rabbit hole, could be a nice little nod to plenty of other media that we've seen in the past that have dealt with crazy things like in the world of Little Nightmares. What I mean is, if we look at the world of Little Nightmares, we don't actually know what it represents. We don't know if it's a nightmare, we don't know if it's supposed to be a real world that has been corrupted by something, we don't know if all of this is just someone's imagination, very similar to Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland was always kept very, very ambiguous. We don't fully know if Wonderland actually exists, or if it's all just a symptom of Alice's mental health. This is also very interesting when you see that there's a lot of drug references in Alice in Wonderland. There are a hell of a lot of them, which could explain where Alice gets all of these ideas from. It could be yet another hint that it's all in her head. We could also apply this to the gnomes in Little Nightmares. We have, well, literal mushrooms running around all over the place, which could be a subtle hint that this world isn't, well, quite as real as we once thought. At the very least, it's an interesting concept. The idea that this entire world could be just somebody's crazy drug trip, which, let's be honest, some of the ideas that Tarsier Studios come out with were, well, very out there. This also kind of leaks into our own world though as well. The gnomes are called gnomes, but we also have gnomes in our world too, although the spelling's slightly different and that is also relevant. In our world we have garden gnomes, which are based on gnomes of folklore. Garden gnomes also have pointy heads, although they usually have red hats on, but they are generally used as good luck charms, now more so just for decoration. But they're also used to protect people's crops, protect people's properties and valuables as well. Gnomes in mythology were mischievous little creatures, but they weren't bad ones. Generally speaking, they usually help humans, which is interesting because the gnomes in Little Nightmares are very similar. They can be very mischievous, but they generally don't harm humans. They either run away from them or they attempt to help them once they realize if a human is actually on their side or not. Garden gnomes also are often found on toadstools, the joke being that a toadstool is a perfect sized stool for a garden gnome. But the gnomes from Little Nightmares aren't spelt with a G, they are spelled N-O-M-E-S, which could also be significant. I've had this thought for a while now, but the name gnomes could be a subtle little hint to what went on with them. If you take the name gnomes singularly as gnome, you could split that into two words, know me. That could be a very cheeky subtle foreshadowing that the gnomes have lost themselves. They don't have a me anymore because they lost their original body. They were transformed from a human child into a gnome, and now all the gnomes look exactly the same. They have no individuality, they have no me. Another thing I want to mention is this very weird thing that happens in the Pale City. We don't really see many gnomes around the Pale City, in fact I can only think of the one we see in the Hunter's Attic in the Gnome DLC. But what we do see are a bunch of packages with pictures of gnomes on. It's possible that these gnomes are being shipped out to places, possibly being sold like a pet, or sold like a garden gnome. A lot of things in Little Nightmares are basically twisted versions of real life things. And it could be in this world, our version of garden gnomes have been completely twisted into something much more horrifying. Yet people buy them just like they would a garden gnome in our world. The idea that gnomes are being shipped around to people's houses, that they could just put them on display, is pretty horrifying when you think that at least some of the gnomes were made from human children. It's just another nightmarish thing in this world. You're turned into a gnome and then shipped off to some person's house to be essentially an ornament. Another thing that I figured out recently is that of the 6 children that we see in the Little Nightmares 2 artwork, one of them actually looks like he's dressed up like a gnome. A lot of people see this one who looks like he's dressed up like a ghost. He's wearing what appears to be a sheet with 2 holes cut out for his eyes, and he only has 1 arm. But if you look at it, it does kind of look like a gnome's head, although clearly not as pointy, but it does, especially if you look at the bottom, look quite a lot like a gnome's head. If you compare him to the concept art of gnomes as well, the eyes look far more similar to a gnome's than I previously thought. Is it possible that this child was dressing up like a gnome because he thought it would make the people ignore him, since we know that most of the monsters in this world just don't seem to bother with the gnomes at all? The only ones we actually see chase the gnomes are the chefs, which honestly makes sense. They probably want to cook them, especially if, like we said, they are essentially made out of mushroom in this world. So there we have it, some things you might not have known about the gnomes in Little Nightmares. These creatures are actually a lot more interesting than I first thought, and it's no wonder that a whole DLC segment was given to them. If you did enjoy this video, please let me know down in the comments below and consider subscribing so you don't miss my other content, which is usually on horror games just like Little Nightmares. If you did find this video useful, don't forget to give it a like. My name has been Tericho, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.